Ladies and gentlemen, there are still some people who are having their coffee. But we're going to start this session. Now, I have been told that the air conditioning has been turned on as high as possible, which is a real shame, actually, because we have all the doors open, doing exactly the wrong thing, because the cold air is going outside and the warm air is coming in. But I probably would suggest to turn it off, but I think you'd all die and kill me, so we're not going to do that. What we're going to do instead is talk about why is it so darn hot in here? Why has it been for the last 5 months absolutely gorgeous in Northern Europe? Why is it have we had countless episodes of disasters from fires? I had Anders calling me in June saying we have a crisis in Sweden. I've never seen so many fires. And we don't have enough firemen. So we're asking the Portuguese and the Spanish who know how to put these fires out, but they've got their own fires. So what are we supposed to do? $340 billion spent just in 2017 on natural disasters, not counting actually the human loss or direct impacts to people. So it's absolutely crucial that we talk about the importance of climate change. We have the phenomenal Professor Schellnhuber who is here to give an Aurelio Pache lecture on this very topic, world-renowned for all his incredible work in this area. And then we have a panel conversation that will very much address what the professor will tell us, but also some of the work that the Club of Rome has been doing and that Anders will speak about and myself around creating a climate emergency plan. So can I ask the technical assistants in the back to dim down the lights a little bit, because we're going to have a bit of a movie. As we spoke about the arts earlier, this is part of the vision. So Professor, please come up. Your podium is waiting for you. Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody, in particular those who are still with the coffee. That was a joke. I have to tell you right from the beginning that I'm sometimes joking. And if we dim the light, so something happened also to the voice. We dim the lights and then we... interesting. No. Interesting. So either light or voice. Very interesting. You have to just speak into it a bit more. Yeah, but... Okay. No. Okay. What is very good?
No, it's not working.
No.
So with the greatest intentions at the end of the day, it's not technology that's going to save us all.
And this doesn't work either?
Does it work? Yeah. Check it. Yeah, it does. Hello, hello. Can you hear me?
Is it better? Yeah.
No?
Not really. No, it says dim as the other one.
Okay. No, you're right, it's not working.
No, it's not working. Hello? No. Okay, thank you very much for listening to me.
No, we're not going to let you get off that easily, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, sure, but... So maybe we have to light again, and maybe the voice comes back.
Turn the lights back on. Can I ask you to turn the lights back on? Luminare. Okay. There we go. Are the micro? Yes, now they're working.
I thought so. I'm a physicist, and it seems that I have just turned down the entire power, actually. Yeah? So with the light, also the microphone and so on, which is an interesting experiment, actually. So we all did this social experiment today, this afternoon. Yeah? So you see, it's not a good idea to have just one control parameter for a complex system. Huh? Oh. Okay. Okay. Italian ingenuity has solved the problem after all. Thank you very much. I think we are now all set, even people from the coffee stand are flowing in, so I can finally deliver the Aurelio Pecce lecture, which is a big, big honor for me. I had just the opportunity to talk to several of the lovely members of the Pecce family, which is a big honor for me. They are very international, living in Argentina and Florida and in Italy and so on. It's wonderful to deliver a lecture in the footsteps of Aurelio Pecce. So here we go. And actually, I will not entirely talk about climate change, so I will disappoint you or maybe surprise you, but of course in the beginning I'll talk a little bit about that, because my fellow and actually successor at the Potsdam Institute, Johan Rockstro, already introduced some of our thinking, you know, the planetary boundaries. I was a co-author of that paper, The Tipping Points, which we published back in 2008. And the recent paper, which I will discuss a little bit, because I think it's a landmark paper, I think it's a game changer, called Trajectories of the Earth System in the Anthropocene. It was published on the 8th of August 2018 in Proceeding of the US National Academy of Sciences, and was downloaded within a week 400,000 times, which is not an Instagram thing by a celebrity, but this is a scientific publication, and it made a huge splash, so I will refer to that. So the title of my talk is Climate Complexity Conversion, and I will actually pull you out of your comfort zone in the end, or maybe your familiar discomfort zone, that is a global environmental change, and try to push you into an unfamiliar discomfort zone. So be braced for that. Don't run away. But we dimmed the light does not mean you are allowed to fall to sleep, because I can see you all here. So let's start, if it works. Yeah. Actually, I want to start with big ideas, really, because we are all descendants, heirs, whatever, of the Enlightenment before the Renaissance, which was delivered in Italy first, in Florence and Pisa, and so on. But you see, this was the beginning of it all. Les Lumières, as the French say, die Aufklärung, as the Germans say, the Enlightenment. And you have on the left-hand side the people who delivered the encyclopedia. So, Denis Diderot, Laurent d'Alembert, a famous mathematician. When in the middle you see the Scottish philosopher David Hume and the great geologist James Hutton. And on the right-hand side, the German schools, or Immanuel Kant, obviously. But then also a very, very important figure who, for the first time, created something like an interdisciplinary view on the world, that is Alexander von Humboldt. So that was the Enlightenment, and let's move on. So, when in the 20th century, you know, operations research was developed, so we had Lev Pontriag in optimal control, you had Frank Ramsey, a prodigy, amazing brain, At the age of 26, he more or less invented everything that was not invented before. John von Neumann, who was at the same level, unbelievable brain. And Herb Simon, who introduced this bounded rationality thing. So there is no optimal control in this world. You have bounded rationality, and maybe you have no rationality at all. I come to that. Then, of course, we all stand off the shoulders of system dynamics, which was introduced by J. Forrester. When, of course, the famous, and I have to simply mention it today, the famous limits to growth with the well-known protagonists. One of them is here. Where is Jorgen? There he is. Okay. Cheers to Jorgen. That didn't work. Cheers to Jorgen. Thank you. So let's move on. And then, of course, the principles of the Enlightenment were put into question, actually. So we had Paul Feyerabend, Jacques Derrida, constructionism, deconstructionism, all that. We had Mode 2, science, deliberations, Helga Novotny, Michael Gibbons, and so on. That was okay, of course. This is part of the philosophical, epistemological discourse. But of course, this was ending with the person on the right side of this slide. But instead of questioning evidence, you just ignore or distort evidence. What means everything you don't like is fake news, and the real news is made fake news actually by distortion. So you had here, I just mentioned Kelly Garrett, who first wrote an article about echo chambers, and of course my good colleague Naomi Oreskes, The Merchants of Doubt. How people started, like in the tobacco industry, so the oil industry, started to distort the scientific evidence and to come up with global climate denialism, which was extremely successful, we have to say this. I think only in the last few years we have overcome that. We are winning the war, but we lost many battles along the way. And so we have this, and this you may call Schellnhuber's law, namely, we always talk about cognitive dissonance. Why are people going to the movie with the reassuring lie? So that was shown before, and not to the inconvenient truth. And so my law is the following one, and it needs empirical underpinning, of course, that you see the sum of threat and attention is a constant. Now think about it a little bit. That means the bigger the threat and the more obvious the threat is, the less we pay attention to it, simply because we cannot bear it. So you see this was the situation in the 1990s. Everybody talked about global warming. Why? Because it was a distant sort of entertaining threat, like you see, a crime movie or something like that, because you are not part of the picture. So if people get murdered, it's good entertainment as long as it's not your relatives. But later on today, the threat is overwhelming. That's what we just talked about. I could sort of count down innumerable natural disasters we have seen over the last 10 years. This year, last year, and so on. The writing on the wall is overwhelming now. Everybody can read it. The letters are as big as possible. But nobody wants to take care, actually. Because people rather say, oh, game over. We didn't pay attention for 30 years, and now we see it's too late. So let's carry on, as we always did. That is human nature, actually. But we have to change not human nature, but we have to bring out the best in human nature, which is also present, of course. So let me move on. So we had, of course, something happened. The IPCC. And, I cannot refrain from showing you another cartoon in this context, which is this one. You see? This is the world, including ourselves, sleeping along into the morning, and you have another IPCC alarm. But you see how many alarms have been just demolished. Just keep me alone. That is the situation right now. And of course, the IPCC says quite rightly, between 1.5 and 2 degrees, something dramatic will be happening. I refer to that a little bit later. But does it really wake up the world? Does it wake up the planet? Maybe. But it will not happen just by the IPCC report. So let me go to this movie, which I announced proudly. And it is just to show you, and we work together with artists in order to produce it, how global emissions have risen since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. You can see it as a measure of wealth production, actually, without the externalities, of course. Why did we get rich through the Industrial Revolution? Because of the emissions, because we burned coal and then oil and gas. And this will show you now, in terms of a specific metric, how the planet was carbonized. So hopefully it works. Yes, it does. And it all started in merry old England, of course, you know, the Black Country around Birmingham and so on. And the column, you see the 1780 down there at the bottom. And now you see London, the London column growing here. So London, where you burned a lot of coal because we had no wood anymore for heating the house because the forests were cut down. And now you see how the Industrial Revolution spreads across Europe. So Germany was second, and Poland. If you think of why are the Polish so stubborn about coal, we were actually the pioneer of using coal. And now you see on the British Isles how the columns are growing. You see Paris growing. Finally, you will see Berlin growing. You will see nothing in Italy, only a little bit, but it will come along soon. And you see the global emissions. Now we turn across the Atlantic, and you see New York City, you see Chicago, and you can pick your favorite city in the United States and see how the emissions grow. These are cumulative emissions. So you see 5,000 megatons CO2. Now we can watch Tokyo growing on the other side of the planet. And now we are going today, now we're going into the future and see how the planet is developing into a carbon hedgehog, actually. So we are in 2030 now, 2040. This is business as usual. And you see what is becoming of this planet. And it will end in 2100. So this is more or less the complete decarbonization of the planet. It even includes Africa, not in the same way as England and so on. Is this our fate? Is this our future? Well, I show you what effect the current emissions have already had. So this is a paper we published in Nature 2 years ago. It explains why we have ice ages. So over the last 2.5 million years, the planet moved into this waxing and waning of ice sheets. So we had this permanent oscillation between warm and cold times. And this function is explaining why it happened. It's a very simple function. If you look on top of the panel, it is an exponential function. It has just two factors. You do not need to understand it now, but I tell you more or less the essence about it. One factor is insolation. That means according to the orbit of the Earth around the Sun, the tilt of the Earth axis, and also the wobbling of the Earth axis, which is a purely gravitational effect, which we can calculate 10 million years back and 10 million years forward. It's sheer physics. That is changing, of course, the insolation you get on the northern hemisphere. The other factor is CO2 in the atmosphere. And actually, if you look down now, these are the last 800,000 years. Excuse me. Whenever the blue line is crossing the black line is the critical CO2 in the atmosphere, according to the insolation you have. whenever the blue line, which is the real CO2 you have, which we can reproduce over millions of years now, ice core measurements and so on. Whenever the blue line is crossing from the left, the black line, there will be an ice age. And now you can count it down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We produced this function when we looked at the data, and it's absolutely precise. These are the beginnings of the ice ages. So, the whole planetary dynamics in the so-called quaternary can be reduced to this function here, which is a triumph of science, of course. But the really interesting question is, when will be the next ice age? Can the function tell us also what will happen in the future? And I will tell you. So some people have speculated the next ice age will be next week. I can tell you it's not true. Don't believe it. It will happen. I blow it up. Actually, never again. That's why we are in the Anthropocene. Remember, if the blue line is crossing or cutting the black line from the left, there will be another glacial inception. Now, this is 100,000 years into the future. And if you look where, in 50,000 years, there would be another ice age. But only if the CO2 would not be influenced by human intervention. Actually, now the atmospheric content is according to the orange line, and you see the lines are not crossing anymore. But we will add another billion and 100 billions of tons CO2. We rather will have to use the brown line. So there will be no ice age anymore. The human impact is so powerful already, that's why we talk about the Anthropocene, that we have suppressed the quaternary planetary dynamics already. This is a fact, but let's see what will happen in the future beyond that. So, just for you to remember, the Holocene mode of operation, the last 12,000 years where human civilization was created, will not come back, not for the next millions of years. It's just done. What will happen instead? And we have in this paper, Stefan et al., which I mentioned in the beginning, we have discussed 14 feedback loops actually. You have so-called tipping elements. Give you an example. Greenland is melting, that means there will be a huge freshwater impulse into the Atlantic Ocean that will suppress the thermaline circulation, so-called Gulf Stream. If the Gulf Stream will be shut down, this has a major impact on the southern Atlantic, in particular on the algae production there, and so on. So that's one of the possible cascades. Looked at 14 of these cascades. And it turns out that there are two alternatives left, namely, either if we try to park the Earth system, and it's now very important, in spite of the dimming of the light, this is a moment where you should not sleep. So if your neighbor has fallen asleep now, just give him a sort of, try to be cruel. Because this is the very moment which you have to take home. So when we try, according to the Paris Agreement, to park the planet safely between 1.5 and 2 degrees, that seems to be the right option. But will the planet just stay put there? If you just push it according to some atmospheric calculation by 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees? Or will it just spin out of control and just go down a slippery slope? If you look back in Earth history, there are two alternatives. So what I'm talking about is, of course, based on computer simulations and everything. But in particular, it's based on empirical evidence, because we can reconstruct the fate of the planet and the climate system for millions and millions of years. So if you look back, there are two alternatives, actually. Let me see. Yes, we go back to that. You either end up with, say, 500 ppm. We have now 410, and we are on the course of towards 500 ppm. you either end up in the so-called mid-Pliocene, that was 3 million years ago, where the Earth, in fact, was 2 or 3 degrees warmer, and sea level was at least 10 meters higher. But under the same condition, more or less. You could also go back to the mid-Miocene, 15 million years ago, where the Earth was 5 degrees warmer and sea level was 60 meters higher. So with the same boundary condition, you could either have a situation where human civilization could simply not exist, or something, forget the Holocene, if we would go into the Pliocene, we might somehow adapt to it. We might manage, just so. But this is what the paper said. The jury is still out on that. And what is the knack here? What is the real secret behind it? It's path dependence. If the boundary conditions are the same, but you could end up in 2 different states, it depends on the path you have taken for this trajectory. Yeah? And we simply don't know yet whether the current path will lead us 50 million years back or just 3 million years back. So look up the paper. It is the summary of what thousands of scientists have put together. It's a meta-study, but it is posing the most important questions of all, actually. Do we still have a chance to preserve civilization on Earth? And I think this is well within the context of a Pechai lecture. So, of course, we talked about Johan did that rapid decarbonization, and I don't want to bore you with that because everybody knows that we need a sort of exponential decarbonization right now. That's the only way to still have a chance actually to save us into the Pliocene, not going back to the Holocene. Huh? And of course we could discuss solutions and so on, but let me just go directly into what I said is the unfamiliar discomfort zone for all of us. Because this is not the whole story. Of course, climate is defining in a sense. If we are not able to solve the climate crisis, then we can forget about all the other issues. If you are on a ship in a heavy storm and water is pouring into the hulk, then of course, I mean, you need to just get and keep the ship afloat. You don't have to worry about the quality of the kitchen or whether the staff is well paid and things like that. You have to keep the ship afloat. That is solving the climate problem. But then the story is not over, of course. Huh? If you have solved this problem, then we have to talk about the other issues, and I bring just 3 of them. So, of course, it's environmental degradation, but it's also social disintegration. So it's not just the wealthy get wealthier and so on. The social cohesion seems to be disrupted everywhere now. And you have digitalization. That was actually mentioned on a panel before. If you think climate change is a big challenge, just wait for digitalization. No? And now it could go good or wrong, and actually the bad narrative is these 3 things are reinforcing themselves. So, because of environmental degradation, you have the motto, save yourself who can, no cooperation anymore. Or disruptive digitalization just helps consumerism to go beyond any bounds. I call it Amazonization of the world. And of course, social disintegration, you have certainly heard about these Japanese guys who just during their weekend live in virtual worlds. They play games. They just get away from reality. How could you have empathy, human empathy, if everybody's living in their own digital universe? Yeah? So social disintegration would be amplified by digitalization. Or the other way around, environmental degradation means meeting the challenge together. We rally behind an enlightened leader. We actually will use smart systems, innovation for decarbonizing the world, and we will all develop something like a global conscience and a global consciousness through digitalization. We will all become part of a global subject, if you like. Maybe some of you have read the beautiful novel by Stanislav Lem, Solaris, when you should hurry up and do it. Where in the end it turns out the ocean is actually the combination of a superorganism, which has turned into a planetary entity, but could happen through social media. So, complex systems. I have tried to understand complex systems for 35 years. I first studied mathematics and physics, and when moved into what we called chaos science at the time. Of course, when we tried to come up with a more decent notion, because whenever you said, I'm a chaos scientist, everybody started to laugh and said, I don't want to see your office, it must be horrible, actually. So now we talk about complex nonlinear dynamics and blah, blah, like that. But what is the hallmark of complex systems? They are hard to understand, yes. They are hard to predict, yes. But in particular, they are hard to manage. Now, if we move on, just an example is a city. If you do a fractal analysis of cities, so that's something I did a little bit. I spent some time on fractal analysis. We'll find cities in general have a fractal dimension of 1.7. But what will be the city of the future? Everybody talks about urbanization, and people just take it for granted that cities will just grow concentric rings, London, Paris, Berlin, New York City, and so on. Is this really the future? Now, if you factor in renewable energy, digital revolution, cyberspace education, additive manufacturing, novel materials, circular economy, modular mobility, urban farming, maybe urbanization will be reversed. So we will go back to the area. So my hypothesis is actually the following one. So my friend Jeffrey West wrote this New York Times bestseller, Scale, which is a very interesting one. My conjecture is actually that the fractal dimension of cities will be smaller in the future. That means urbanizations will be more tenuous objects. Finally, digital disruptions. So this is where it all started, actually. When I was a young researcher in solid-state physics, back in the 1970s, we tried to understand so-called spin glasses. So we understood already crystals, but can you understand a glass? Why is a glass transparent, for example? Why does it form at all? And it turned out that we needed a metaphor for it. And the metaphor was the human brain. So we tried to study the human brain, the so-called neural networks, in order to understand spin glasses. We still have not understood the spin glasses, but we have advanced our knowledge of the neural networks and the human brain. So that is serendipity in science. You cannot plan it. And so there was the Hopfield model published in PNAS in 1982. And when with spin glass models of neural networks by Amit Gutfreund and Sompolinsky, this is the beginning of the artificial intelligence revolution, actually. It all started with solid-state physics. Nobody could predict it. But we are not at the end of a journey, quite to the contrary. So, artificial intelligence may be used for anything, medical diagnosis, maybe even replacing judges by artificial intelligence systems, where it might be more objective, maybe even replacing the IPCC by an artificial intelligence system. It will save us a lot of time because it's just a meta-analysis we are doing, and so on. What will happen to the workforce? You see, this is the cartoon. So in the beginning, you sort of behave like a computer. In the end, the robot will kick you out. But the real revolution, and when I was asked to give this lecture, I was trying to put myself in the shoes of Aurelio Peccei, who was a giant, of course, because at that time, you know, when computers just were emerging in system dynamics and so on, he took a look 50 years ahead, more or less. So if he would be here today, I'm sure he would talk about artificial intelligence, and he would talk about quantum computing. So I wasted part of my youth on the foundations of quantum theory, and but that means I have a solid understanding of quantum dynamics. If we are able to build a system of, say, 500 qubits at its core, sort of basic entities of quantum computing, we will beat any conventional computer. I think this is around the corner another 10 years. And now is the really interesting point. Neural networks, artificial intelligence, who play chess and so on, better than any expert, they are based on just repeating the same operation all the time, but extremely rapidly. And they make errors. Quantum computing is also making errors. If you apply it to a system which can tolerate errors, you are in business. So the grand unification will be in disruptive technologies, will be the marriage of quantum computing and artificial intelligence. And it will multiply our tools, our cognitive tools, by a factor of 1 million or 1 billion. I'm absolutely sure about that. Are we ready for that? Are we prepared for that? You see, the most powerful tools in human history are being developed right now. Are we applying them to the most urgent problems of humanity right now? Now, climate change and so on. No, not at all. We try to build autonomous cars and more gadgets and entertainment, virtual worlds and so on. The most powerful tools of humanity ever developed are not applied to the crisis we are facing right now. So, for example, we are about just across the road. I had the privilege 3 years ago to deliver the encyclical Laudato Si, and together with Cardinal Turkson. And close by you have this beautiful painting of Michelangelo, you know, the creation of Adam. But maybe there is a sequel to that. It looks like this. I'll do it again. So you see, Adam is moving his hand, and I call it the creation of Aryan. Aryan, of course, stands for artificial intelligence. So we just pass on the baton. God created Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens is creating artificial intelligence. And you know what happened to Homo sapiens after being created. Is this the future? Do we have any concepts for that? So my final slide is the following one. This technological revolution will happen whether we like it or not. We have to contain it, confine it, maybe even decelerate it. Think of the Industrial Revolution. It has created class struggle, it has created 2 world wars, it has created all types of catastrophe. Of course, it has made some people very rich, but it has killed 100 million people probably on the way. Should the same happen with this marriage between artificial intelligence and quantum computing? And you see, the final thought that crossed my mind when I prepared this lecture is the following. What if we will not be able to solve the environmental crisis? So this planet becomes uninhabitable for human beings. But who cares? Because we will replace human beings by cyborgs who can stand any climate. If you think this is crazy, you are right. But believe me, there are people out there who have precisely this type of thinking. And I think the Club of Rome, if it is relaunched today, should actually precisely think about that. And actually turn artificial intelligence into a blessing instead of just a threat. And this could happen, for example, the next generation of world models could be just neural networks, for example. In climate modeling, we think about replacing the big machines and the big sort of softwares by neural networks. And this may be as disruptive as system dynamics was 50 years ago, actually. So that means it will be a brave new world. It may be actually the end of civilization in various ways. But we should not lose courage, actually. Our thinking, your thinking, the thinking of Aurelio Peccei is more needed than ever. Thank you.
Thank you so much for challenging us in a variety of different ways, both in terms of maybe swallowing the alarm clock, which is something that Connie Hedegaard actually said she did. Sorry, not Connie, Christiana Figueres. You may have swallowed another alarm clock. That one was ticking Europe, Europe. But Christiana Figueres clearly indicated that she swallowed an alarm clock, and she has said it countless times. And so maybe what we need to do is implant an alarm clock into everyone so they realize that every time it's triggered, they have to rethink, because we can't continuously pound it on its head. And thank you also for reminding us, because I think this is something that we've struggled in the climate emergency plan, which Anders will actually speak about in a little bit, which is how do we optimize AI? How do we optimize digitalization so that it serves the people, serves our causes, rather than does runaway damage? And that's a fundamental question. So if you could answer maybe those, and then we can also open it up to some questions. Good, so we need a microphone that works.
I mean, while you decide whether you want to ask a question or not, so I give you the opportunity. Let me address the question you just asked. Now, I think it will be defining whether we will be able, you could call it sort of sustainability through digitalization. So everybody talks about smart cities, you know, smart agriculture, but the proof still has to be provided. This is just buzzwords sort of dropped in management circles at the Davos meeting and so on. Nothing against Davos, but there are many buzzwords up there in the Alps. So it is the question whether we can harness digitalization for sustainability. But the other question is clearly, is there such a thing as sustainable digitalization, which is not either run by oligarchs in Silicon Valley or by the Chinese Communist Party? I mean, I'm not making a value judgment, not at all. But these are the people who are now sort of looking at that. Is there maybe something like a European way in the tradition of the Enlightenment? We will use the tools, but we will use them in order to strengthen our humanistic values. And we have to hurry up, because the alternatives are being unfolded before our very eyes, actually.
And then we have episodes like Cambridge Analytica and the way in which data is manipulated, and that creates another dynamic which is quite frightening. Jorgen?
Well, thank you for a fantastic talk, John. I'm a great admirer of your effort to keep the fight going and impressively moving it into new eras all the time with new input and new interesting perspectives. I have one worry about what you and your friends are currently doing, and that is that you're mixing the time constants in a number of the phenomena that you're talking about. And I think that, you know, you're talking in one sentence about things that will happen in 1 million years. In another one, you're talking about phenomena that takes 10 million years. Then you have 100,000, then you have 10,000, etc. I think what will happen in the world is what you fear, that man will not rise to the occasion sufficiently to avoid the climate problem on one side, you know, digitization on the other side. But then comes the interesting question, to what extent will we fail? And how quickly does the damage arise when we fail? And to talk about the most concrete one, you know, when we fail on the climate side, when we let the temperature exceed, you know, 1.5 to 2 degrees, my models, like your models, show that we're then locked into a development over the next 500 years while the tundra is melting. And so it will take 500 years to get to the plus 3 to 4 to 5 degrees, which will be the end state once that had happened. That is not a stable state either, but then it will take hundreds of thousands of years. So my question to you is that, do you think that when we continue the effort to try to make mankind wake up, that we perhaps should try to talk about how unpleasant it will be during those 500 years? You know, we're not going to fall over a cliff, but we have 500 years to adapt. And perhaps optimal adaptation is a better strategy than what you and I have been fighting for.
Yeah, okay. Let me answer it directly because it's such a rich question. So I will not take others for the time being, but of course later. Now, first of all, we are not mixing up time scales. We have to consider all of them in parallel, unfortunately. And I just introduced the Pliocene and the Miocene and all these stupid names geologists have developed simply because this is our reality lab. I mean, if I cannot see under comparable conditions a major shift in the state of the planet in the back, back in 50 million years, when I have no evidence, actually. So this is just in order to underpin some of the things. And looking forward, I mean, I apologize for that, but we have actually ended the ice age cycle, the glacial dynamics, for good or for bad or for whatever. That's how it is. But your question is, of course, extremely important. Because I once coined, we had a meeting at the Belgium Academy of Sciences, and I coined this expression, which became quite sort of seminal, actually, avoiding the unmanageable and managing the unavoidable. So you see, avoiding the unmanageable would be 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees. I'm pretty sure we cannot adapt to that. But if the world warms by 1, it has warmed already by 1 degree, and actually half of a degree is masked by air pollution. So if you would clean the air over China, India, and so on, immediately you get another half degree. So 1.5 degree, we are there already. Yeah? But if we stop it at 2.5 degrees, maybe, and actually CO2 stays within the carbon cycle for more than 20,000 years. People think this is a matter of 100 years. Yes, it goes into the sediment, but it's remineralized and goes back into the air and so on. So it's longer lived than plutonium, actually, yeah? Atmospheric CO2. So, yes, can we survive those 500 years if we hold the 2.5 or 2 degrees line? Yes, we could. Not everybody. But we would need to introduce real instrument for adaptation. I'll give you one example, because I proposed this at a huge political meeting in Germany, and it has created a shitstorm, of course, but also very positive resonance. Have you ever heard about the Nansen passport? Some of you have. Fridtjof Nansen, the godfather of polar research, received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1923, I guess, because after the First World War, when millions, tens of millions of people became refugees, they were expelled from the Soviet Union, for example, Marc Chagall, Igor Stravinsky, and so on. He proposed an international passport for refugees. And about 50 countries accepted it. And I believe that we would introduce a climate passport in this world. You do not do top-down migration, no? Where in a Stalinistic way you say, you million go from Texas to Florida or so on. No, you would empower individuals with a passport to choose their own pathway in this world. So in particular, the small island states, if we are responsible for destroying their territory, and we are doing that for sure, shouldn't they be given a climate passport to choose any country which is responsible for their destruction? That would be an absolutely logical thing. Now, propose this to Donald Trump. Of course, this is the worst thing you could imagine. But it would be completely in the spirit of Fridtjof Nansen. So what I'm saying is, talking about adaptation is wonderful. We build a seawall here, and we have drop irrigation of plants in the Negev desert and so on. That's all wonderful. It will not change anything. Introduce 4, 5, 6 disruptive institutional innovations, like a climate passport. And when you start talking, and when you will see, and it could turn out that people are so horrified by these adaptation measures like a climate passport, but they will move on with mitigation actually, in order to avoid it. So that would be my answer.
So I have a question here, I have one there, and I have one. There are two people in the back there that I'd like after this question. Over here first. This one first, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for a brilliant, brilliant lecture. I'd like to touch on one thing that I believe is not adequately addressed by IPCC, and it's avoided. For the past 10 years since I quit my day job, I don't study climate science per se, I study the climate scientists and what they're saying. So I'm constantly taking a polling factored in with the credibility of the climate scientist involved. And the one thing that I'm hearing, or not hearing, the thing that's being left out continually is the methane release, the East Siberian methane release. I know Jason Box famously released a tweet with an epithet, "We're screwed."
We are fucked, actually.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And
let's talk Turkey about
when
it.
he heard that the Laptev Sea was also
I talked to him about that.
Yeah. So where do you see? I don't see that we have a 100-year or a 500-year timeline if that happens. And how do you factor in the probability of that occurring?
Okay. Now, extremely important question. Actually, in the supporting information of that paper, Stefan et al., published in PNAS, you will find actually an assessment of that. And I did a special issue also a while ago on tipping elements in the Earth system, where we also looked at the tundra, thawing, methane release. Actually, the story is even more complicated because most of the methane is sitting on the ocean shelves. That is the so-called methane cleft rates, methane, ice, whatever you have within the ocean sediments. And we looked at the dynamics, and actually it turns out the dynamics is very slow. So once you would have global warming of the ocean shelf and so on, it would be released, it would be converted, most of it into CO2, so it would not stay methane, which is good and bad because the warming power is smaller, but it will last much longer actually. So all in all, it's negative. But we found that this process would take 1,000 years, but it cannot be stopped anymore. So once you open the lid, you put away the lid on the ocean shelves. It just goes on and on and on, and you cannot stop it anymore. For the tundra, we do not have something similar. I just know that we tried to publish 15 years ago a paper on it, methane feedback, and everybody ridiculed it. But we now talk to Russian scientists anyway, you know, we walk around. And you may have seen this famous movie where you have a scientist, he's making a hole in the ice, and when he puts a match there, and the fire comes out, so you can see it anywhere you like, actually. What we can say is that we have done much too little research on it. This whole notion of tipping points was completely ridiculed in the beginning, because people said, well, it's all linear, it's all gradual, it's all incremental. A good scientist does not even talk about disruption, but it is only what investment bankers do. But now everybody talks about it. But we have lost actually in science, in economy, in politics, in society, we have lost more or less 3 decades in order to address the problem. I don't want to entirely depress you, actually. So maybe with a good gelato or something, you can be cheered up again after my lecture. But sorry, this is the inconvenient truth.
Yeah, hold on. Yes, please. So I'm going to take the 3 questions at the same time, if I may.
Yeah, maybe better.
Yes, can you hear me?
No.
No.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, my question would be about, because you talked a lot about technological innovation, how this can be a disrupting or a tipping point in a system. But how are we sure that this tipping point of, or possible tipping point of technological innovation is not a reinforcing feedback of the goal of our current system right now? Because if we see, if the whole Bitcoin thing, even about artificial intelligence, will need more data collecting. Data collecting needs to be stored. Data storage, 60% of the energy that goes into data storage is not clean at all. And how are we sure that this technological innovation is not even, will produce even more CO2? And it's not this clean buzzword that we are thinking about it.
Okay, thanks.
Excellent question. Next one, please. And then there's one in the back.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Tobias Ort from University Ulm in Germany. So now I'm free to speak. My question is regarding the institutionalization of the ideas and effort into influencing international organizations, politicians, to actually put change into place, into regulation. So we talked about change, we talked to one minister, what he can do at summits, but how about changes in, for example, the World Trade Organization, in different other international organizations, strengthen the United Nations? Because from my point of view, to create a new institution that is as powerful as it is needed might be too difficult and too much time. No one would sign it, actually.
Sure.
So my question is on the transformation of the existing institutions into the our direction that has been discussed.
Also an excellent question. What I'll do is I'll ask you, John, to answer, but also we have here two former parts of institutions, a commissioner and also an MEP, and I'd like them to reflect on that as well. Susanna.
Thank you very much. My name is Susanna Karp. I work for Sandbag. It's a climate policy think tank in Brussels and in London. My question is actually also connected to the carbon grid intensity, which would obviously be connected to your artificial intelligence scenario. And so I'm wondering whether in the case that we would very heavily develop this sector, we wouldn't be in fact faced with the same problematic, which is the need to decarbonize the power sector. Because even if China, as you mentioned, would go ahead with the plan that you referred to, it wouldn't change the problem that their power sector is heavily dependent on coal. And so at some point you're still running against the same planetary boundaries that we were discussing earlier. And so perhaps even this scenario still brings us to the same problematic, which is that we fundamentally need to rethink the way that we're using resources. And so just wondering what your opinion on that was.
Yeah,
So thank
okay.
you.
No, thanks. Yeah. I'll try to answer these questions. Maybe the two together, the first and the third one. Now, clearly you can do just extrapolation and see if the internet keeps on growing, the social media and everything, consuming electricity, which is more or less produced by coal and nuclear energy and so on, when it might become the dominant consumer of energy in the world, actually, in 2 decades from now. I mean, there are two answers to that. One is, if you would really go into quantum computing, you could save a lot of energy, actually. So we are still doing old-fashioned computing. It's like the combustion engine for cars. This is ridiculous. This was invented 150 years ago. At the same time, the electric car was invented by Werner von Siemens, by the way, which is 90% efficient. And we were driving for a century with cars which are only 20% energy efficient. It's completely mind-boggling. The same is true with you know, hardwired electronics. Of course, you have Moore's law and all these things, but we're still consuming tremendous energy for doing digital calculations. If you would move into quantum interference for computing, then you could save a lot of money. But that is just part of the answer, because it would be one idiosyncratic solution. The broader thing would be, I could imagine what we would measure just everything in terms of CO2 output. Yeah? You could introduce even a parallel currency, not Bitcoin, but CO2 credits. You could even have individual trading of CO2 credits at the end of the year, whatever. We thought a little bit about that. I think everything has to be measured during the current crisis for the next 50 years in terms of its CO2 currency. And whether you use emissions trading market or personal carbon credits or a carbon tax, I don't mind. The world needs to be saved, and I'm happy if it is saved in the most inefficient way. The second is on the regulation. Yeah, that is, of course, a very big problem. Actually, it crossed my mind when I was listening in the morning and in the afternoon to this, the nation state, for example. The nation state was born in 1648 in Münster in Osnabrück with the peace treaty after the war of 30 years. Yeah? And ever since it has been around. And we know it will not be able to solve global problems. But if we go, Jorgen, into the climate crisis for 500 years, it will be, of course, the optimal instrument to fight each other. The nation state will have a fantastic renaissance because you can build walls and so on. You can kill all the people you don't want to accept within your boundaries and so on. So this is the crucial time. Now, of course, everybody has thought about the world government. Ernst Ulrich von Weizsäcker is one of the big visionaries here. I mean, Weltinnenpolitik and these things. We had fantastic thinking about it. I would say maybe for the future crisis it could happen. It will come too late for the climate crisis. So the only hope we have is bottom-up self-organization of people. It can be companies, it can be just citizens, it can be faith, religious communities, whatever. You have to form the nuclei of decarbonized societies. And it's a phase transition we have to create. You know, a phase transition is not happening, ice melting, whatever, but 50% of the system are now molten down and therefore are still frozen. It's a fractal. You have small pockets of the new phase within the old phase and so on at all scales. This is self-organization of complex systems. So I do believe in this self-organization. And in the end, it will be powerful ideas, actually. It will be narratives. It will storylines. We have to tell a story where everybody won't love to be part of it, and not a story which you just hate. So in the end, I do believe in the power of good stories.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut it here. Now, we had a couple of questions that talked about the institutionalization. I think we can handle that also in the panel. There were suggestions by Pascal Lamy, the former trade commissioner in the European Commission, and also the former head of the WTO recently, who said we need an environment organization that's as big as the WTO, that can bring the environmental issues cross-cutting across all of the different institutions. But then, of course, some would say we're creating another institution. And that is an issue as well in and of itself. I know that we had some of our members who also wanted to ask some questions, Vala and Herbie. But if it's okay, can we take some of your questions for the next round? John is staying. He's just stepping down, but he's going to be here. And Anders, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I wanted to, John, thank you for a fascinating presentation. We met a couple of weeks ago and we talked about the science policy gap. And I was for 10 years member of the European Parliament. And one of my frustrations was how little capacity we had to really understand what was going on, primarily in some of the rapidly developing technology areas. We had no real technology assessment mechanism. And I told you that when you came to the climate committee that we had established in the European Parliament.
That was 200 years ago, I think.
No, this was 2006 or 2007.
Okay, almost.
And we had presentations by John and a few other scientists, and then we had good discussion for half an hour. But when the scientists left, it was rare that someone among the members could really continue the discussion on a level needed in terms of quality and depth. So and this goes for climate change, but it goes even more for disruptive technologies. And I could tell you 762 members in the European Parliament, a handful have a scientific background, and a handful probably understands more or less what the implications of AI and robotization is for society. And we are always lagging behind with policy frameworks and legislation. And because of the nature of these technologies and what the implications may be, there are opportunities, but there are also risks. How the hell are we going to deal with this? So again, I think you should be a politician.
Okay. Oh, it was not a question, it was actually a pitch for becoming the president of the European Union.
Well, we are in an election cycle, but I'm not sure that Merkel wants you. So maybe you should have a conversation with her, because she's the one who's going to push who's next. So moving on and responding very much directly to your incredible presentation, John, and also the alarm bells that some of us don't feel we can put out, and do not want to put out and want to try to respond to. I'm going to let Anders present very shortly a document and a call to action which we have put together at the Club of Rome, including myself and our fellow colleague Ian Dunlop, and originally also with Jorgen Randers and others. So, Anders, do you want to just give a quick overview of what it is we're talking about at the club right now?
Thank you. And I think I'll leave the background, because both Johan this morning, Jorgen and John have spelled out the situation we are in, and that policies in the past and what is intended in terms of the so-called INDCs is a far cry from what has to happen. And one of the background points I just would like to stress is that we have cut in Europe, and that's my experience. We have cut roughly 20% of territorial emissions over the last 15 to 20 years. But that's happened with incrementalism, small steps here and there, and that you can do within the present system. But what is now required is something much bolder, transformation. And not only transformation of the energy system, but also of a number of other systems, materials, land use, etc. And I don't think people in general, and I don't think policymakers either, really understand the difference. They think we just have to continue more or less as we have been doing. Now, we decided a couple of months ago that we needed what we call an emergency action plan or strategy for the world. And that we saw it as a natural thing for the Club of Rome to take some kind of an initiative and to try to work as a catalyst and bring in partners from different sectors, institutions, research institutions, NGOs, business organizations, you name it. And our starting point is really the IPCC report that came out recently, which basically tells us that we have to cut emissions by half till 2030 in the world, globally, and then go on to do it and have zero emissions, net zero in 2050. So our umbrella is the Global Carbon Law, to encourage everybody to support that and adopt it. And and then we suggest a number of actions that we call action points that we feel could be acted upon immediately, and that would significantly reduce emissions in the short and medium term. Firstly, stop new oil, gas, coal exploration no later than 2020. I'm married to a Norwegian, so this will not be easy when we come to Norway. Phase out fossil fuel subsidies no later than 2020 and redirect those subsidies in support of low carbon technology development. Phase out fossil fuels entirely by 2050. Introduce carbon pricing, primarily or preferably through a tax, and let the proceeds go to support in research and innovation in low carbon technology developments, propping up the welfare state and or reduce other taxes. So, going back to society. Triple renewable investments per annum no later than 2025, and have a specific focus on developing countries, bearing in mind that to have some kind of development, you cannot rely on animal dung and charcoal. You need modern energy carriers, and if renewables are not there, they will use oil, coal, and gas. It's very, very simple. So we have to have a real pitch and upgrade whatever support to developing countries. And that's, by the way, a historic responsibility. Then boost energy efficiency. Then focus real big way on materials. I said yesterday, cement, steel, aluminium, and plastics make up roughly 20% of carbon emissions, and the demand for urban infrastructure is going up like this. If that is going to build with today's materials, today's technologies, only those emissions will more or less eat up the so-called carbon budget for 1.5 or for 2 degrees, not to speak of 1.5 degrees. I would add textiles. Textiles, by and large, is 6% of carbon emissions today. In effect, it's a horror story, the whole business model, because half of what is produced is not really reaching the consumers. So that's another area that we have to work on. Electronics is the same. So materials and energy systems. Then land use. Protect and reforest. Build carbon in agricultural soils, regenerative agriculture, and restore degraded lands. Very, very important. Some people say that 30–40% of carbon emissions could be absorbed that way over time. Then, alluding to the technology aspects, establish a global task force to try to align what we call exponential and digital technologies with the SDG agenda, and in particular in this case, with the climate mitigation agenda. We need to find synergy here, and as you indicated, that's not really happening today. These technologies are used for other purposes. We make a pitch for support of developed removal technologies, both natural ones like forestation or eventually BECCS or whatever, but also other technologies. There is interesting development using carbon, so-called CCU, carbon capture and utilization. I'm still not clear whether it makes sense from a thermodynamic point of view, but I think we have to look into it, because we need a fallback strategy. Because otherwise we may have to rely on so-called negative emissions, and if we are unprepared, it will be even more difficult. Education of girls and reproductive health and family planning being expanded. I said the other day that this is more for the long term. Laranfele said, no, it's happening now, we need it now, because fertility rates in many parts of the world, in particular in Africa, are still very high. The transition has to be just, so we have a number of issues that we develop further and make sure that we help those who are the so-called losers in the transition, etc., etc. And finally, of course, we make a pitch for beyond GDP. We need urgently to stop measuring progress in production growth. We need to distinguish between quantity and quality. So those are the main points. We have received a lot of inputs over the last couple of days. We will refine the document tonight, and then we will launch it.
Thank you. So before I open up the panel for a reflection on this climate emergency plan, maybe I can just add that we are not trying to replace all of the unbelievable work that has been undertaken in particular the last year, including the IPCC report that's just come out, to ensure that we all have swallowed an alarm clock. I think the differentiator with regard to this action plan is exactly what Anders has indicated. We're trying to bring together those key actions that everyone seems to be saying need to be put in place in the next 2 to 10 years in order for us to meet our 1.5 or 2 degree target. And we're all saying that 2 degrees is not an option. For us, it's 1.5. So if we're going to 1.5, we need to look at those solutions. And so the imperative is, it's a moral responsibility for us as the Club of Rome, for us as enlightened leaders, in the regulatory space, as business leaders, as civil society leaders, to take on the pressure of these particular actions and to start to commit to them. And we can only do it through a level of partnership. The last point I'd make is we've had a great deal of conversations within the club. And you can tell from this morning's conversation around the importance of the systems approach and the importance also of the social approach. And one of the things that we very much want to make sure is exactly what, John, part of your message was, and part of Anders' message was in terms of the disconnect between the science and translating the science into policy. This is not just about translating the science into policy. This is about bringing people on the journey. And if we don't do that, we will have greater pushback, we will have more political disruption and more disenfranchisement of so many people because they don't understand what the journey's for, and they're the losers and the most vulnerable. So it's absolutely fundamental that whatever we decide to adopt with the partners and ourselves as the Club of Rome takes that as the main imperative for moving forward and working and getting this action out. So Connie, I'm going to turn to you as a first reaction, more because of your continued work in this area, not only because you were Commissioner of Climate Action and you and I had the pleasure of working together for many years. You are also evaluating projects now for the CoR Foundation as the chair of the CoR Foundation. You're seeing a great deal of projects coming in that actually might be giving us some potential pathways forward. And you're speaking in a variety of different capacities with people across the globe around the urgency of climate and the link also between science, policy, and action. So what are your reflections?
Thank you so much, Sandrine. And I must say that after all these very, very substantial scientific interventions, having a background as a journalist and a policymaker, one can feel a bit sort of, wow, this is really big, and the policymakers should move on. And then you have this question, how on earth to do it? As Anders just said before, somehow it's too big, it's too complex, it's not evil will, it's very important to understand, but it's just, where do you get started and carry people while you go? I like, therefore, your approach very much. And I'll try to comment on 4 or 5 points. First, I have a worry, a concern. Then 4 to 5 points I would like to stress. And then I would try to end up my 10 minutes with a specific proposal. First, my concern. The good thing is that more and more people get the climate change. More and more institutions, more and more business, more and more organizations, governments, mayors, what have we, people really start to get it. Some get it so well that they start to be so impatient that they just want to do something extremely radical, saying, stop the growth, do this, do that. Something that, what you were just referring to, Sandrine, something that, at least in democracies, cannot carry the majority of the voters within the time frame that we have. And that is the very big challenge that we need to be mindful of. And that is why, and I say it very deliberately here, that is why whenever people start to talk about, stop the growth or whatever, I just feel that, yes, it might be that the system should be changed, but if we wait until we have sort of done that, until we start really getting serious about the next steps, then it will be too late, at least for climate. So it's about how we sort of change the growth, how we discuss which kind of growth we need. We cannot afford to lose years going down in the respective trenches. I just think that is really important because some people would so much like now to interpret what they hear about modernizing the model, developing the model. They want so much to hear. It's because they want to change the model fundamentally, and all the forces that do not want change, they are sort of trying to stick together. So I think that is a big risk. And that is why I like this proposal from the Club of Rome and the pragmatism in it and the realism in it very much. Earlier today, Mr. Constanza was saying we need a vision. My vision is that as normal as it is today, that a minister of the environment or climate would also be mindful of the economic situation in his or her country or the job situation or whatever. It should be equally common sense for a finance minister wherever in the 21st century to be mindful of and build it in knowing about our sustainability issues and the climate change challenge. That's not where we are today. That's a very important mental change. And how do we get there? I think that what we should really do is, to be very practical, try and apply some of the principles for policy making that sort of forces governments to change priorities and to get some more long-term thinking into policy making. How to do that? Yeah, of course, this price externalities has been mentioned many times today, not just for emissions, but price externalities. What we want less of should be taxated more. What we want more of should be taxed less. We should make it easy for citizens to make the right choices. More labeling, more visibility. Public procurement must be green and have sustainability as a fundamental criteria. It's not what it is today. Today it's maybe 20% or 30%, it's not 100%. Planning and investments horizons should be 2050. Whatever bigger policy initiative you're taking in 2018 and onwards should bear in mind where you need to go, where your government has signed up to be, according to the Paris Agreement and the SDG Agreement, by 2050. Is this initiative, this package, this policy reform, is that moving us in the right direction, or are we stepping backwards? A set of principles like that, total cost of ownership, life cycle assessment, and new legislation should be measured up against what are the climate impact and a lot of very tangible things where I think that if we started to get that, and that would also lead to another kind of GDP, but if we really start to have these principles for policy making where we would be better at assessing the co-benefits also, we could have another kind of conversation. Of course, we should replace and modernize the GDP. There's one very interesting novel development, I think. I don't know if you have noticed, but there is an international student movement at the economy students for the economy studies. It's really growing, it's really expanding. People want to have changed the curriculum. Very tangible, very precise, but that means actually something. And then just to the last 2 points, and as you were mentioning some of the other things, of course, renewables and all this is key, and efficiency. Some have also mentioned the cap, the farmers, and the EU is right now preparing its next 7-year budget. There's a huge potential there for reforming the agricultural policy so that it works to the benefit of the common good. But I just have to say, it's now. Within the next 12 months, it will be adopted and the budget will be there for the next 7 years. So it's just to say sometimes we have to get first things first. And here is a huge opportunity actually to work on that, also on the research and development side, because that is one of your recommendations as well, more global cooperation on technology and more European cooperation. Well, I've been attending many major economies forum meetings, 17 of the major economies where they discussed this. We discussed, could we find areas where we could develop joint technological solutions? I'm sorry to report, it's not going to happen anytime soon. The will is not there. But, because they see themselves as competitors and all this, but we could do it through the EU budget to make that much more oriented towards developing new kind of societal challenges, battery, storage, aviation fuel, electrical ships. There are numerous things that could be done there. But it's just the pressure has to come between now and the next 12 months. Because else we are in 2027 before we have this discussion again. And then my final point. You say in your report that we should call on International Global Development Agency and development banks, and they should change their priorities, and some of them are doing it. But I have to say, and now I'm sorry, I'm not in any formal job anymore, I can be frank and direct. Houston, there we have a problem. Why? Because the World Bank, the European Investment Bank, some of the multinational banks, they are changing their policy, going away from coal, divesting. Very good. But look what is happening with the Belt and Road Initiative. 64 countries right now, China is investing there. I'm the first to acknowledge that China is doing a lot of good stuff domestically at home in China. But I must say I'm extremely concerned what I see happening with this Belt and Road Initiative. I'll just give you one small example. Bosnia, bordering up to EU. Last year, China invested $4 billion in tiny Bosnia. They are right now investing in 4 to 5 coal-fired plants. In Kosovo, last week, the World Bank said we are not going to sponsor, to co-finance this new coal-fired plant you want to build in Kosovo. And the European Investment Bank has said the same. Look, guess who would be likely coming with the money? And I'm not saying this to sort of point fingers at anybody in particular, but on the other hand, yes, I am. Because we have to start to be a bit more open also on naming where things are not going that well, because there is a risk that we are locking in a very, very bad and old-fashioned structure there for the next decades if we are not waking up and see what is happening there. And then just to my suggestion, because it's easy to say that, yes, we should apply some principles, and they will sit there in the finance ministries and say, yeah, maybe we should, but tomorrow we have to do something different and short-term thing. Why couldn't we work out a very sort of specific checklist, say 6, 8, 10 parameters, where we sort of ask, have you built in your policy making 2050 as a guideline? Do you work with life cycle assessment or total cost of ownership? Do you price externalities? Are you working with a revised GDP? 8, 10, 12 points. Which countries have advanced where? Check the boxes. It's not rocket science, but reach out from Club of Rome to a lot of other parties out there who would like to do that. It might sound very simple, but I have seen in other cases, for instance with the municipalities on climate, that it helps because it stimulates the public debate. Is my country in? Is my country on the right track? And it is not sort of an impossible job to get it done, and with our sort of combined network to get it out there. So, Sandrine, I would just sort of suggest that something very tangible there would be one way of getting this transition of our economy out from the halls of those who understand and who gets the whole thing to those who are really conducting the day-to-day politics. And we have to speed up, because 5 to 10 years from now, then we all know what is at stake. And you know, they are not concerned with 500 years timescales. They are not concerned with 100 years timescale. They need something very tangible that they can present and take care of right now. I think we could do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie. So, John, before you leave, sorry, but you have to replace Juncker in the European Commission. Unfortunately, the budget will have already been agreed, so maybe what we should do is make sure that in the next couple of months we get you, Connie, and Anders, and a few others in the door and have a conversation with him right now, which I think we should do anyway. And the Club of Rome will organize that. We'll organize that, won't we, Anders? Okay? Good. So that's one. If we get you to be president, we'll get you to blackmail the president. Number 2, short-term legacy. You are so right. And I think what I liked from your point was the name and shame, because it's clearly there also. Media knows. We could use this as a campaign. You create a checklist, and you know that if people aren't in, you can start to say something about the fact that they're not in. And it creates that public debate. And the short-term legacy need of each of these politicians is so absolutely imperative if we want to do anything. We have to think, what is it that's going to, unfortunately, help them have their legacy? We have to convince them of their legacy, but then we have to help them prepare their legacy. And that's super important. So I'm going to move on to Ian now, because Ian has been absolutely instrumental in some of the thought leadership that's gone into this climate action plan, again, alongside Jorgen. And Ian has continued to carry it through, also in a country which really, frankly, doesn't carry a lot of weight in the area of climate, from Australia. And I can't remember where we heard it. Was it this morning, Ian? Because now I'm losing days and scope. But someone said that we've had 4 or 5 governments that have pretty much fallen because of 6 governments that have fallen because of the climate issue. And Ian hangs in there. So you have to go to the back. In the back.
Okay. How's that? Thank you, Sandrine. It's actually 6 prime ministers, I think, have fallen to climate change, and will probably be a few more before we get serious about the issue. So if I could just have the slides, I just want to amplify a bit on the point that Anders has made on essentially on the emergency climate plan, reflecting on really what we should draw from the conversations we've heard. We've heard Jorgen, we've heard Johan this morning, we just heard John. As a simple engineer, I guess you say, well, okay, so what is it we do tomorrow morning? So I'd like to bring this down to a rather shorter term focus on where we're going to go. And it seems to me that what we really have to do is to actually reframe the approach in which we're currently using in addressing climate change, because the existing mechanisms are not going to get us to the point we've got to get to. So how do we refine it? And to me, there are 2 critical issues in what the Club of Rome is trying to do that are different. What is the point of difference that we can offer the world that is not just another list of all the good things that should actually happen? And it seems to me there are 2 things. One is the fact that this is an immediate existential risk. And secondly, that we cannot actually solve it unless we adopt an emergency approach. It's not going to get solved with what we currently have in place. I'll just quickly run through a few things, some of which we touched on, and I'll skip through some of these slides. But the overall picture that we got, I think, coming out of Paris, we've seen 1 degree warming. The Paris limits we know about, 2 and 1.5. 1.5 is probably already in the system, as John said. The emission pathways, the index, will get us to 3 plus probably, and the current pathway we're on will end up with 4 plus. And what we're seeing is already major changes at those levels. We probably have got irreversible change in the West Antarctic ice sheet and possibly the Arctic sea ice. 2 degrees is probably the boundary of extremely dangerous climate change. Not dangerous, that's pretty much happening today. Looking at what military experts say, not so much the scientists, but some of the best national security people around the world, 3 degrees will be a world basically of outright chaos. And 4 is probably incompatible with any organised global community. So that's what we're actually facing today. And the problem I have with a lot of the discussion that's going on is that we're not talking about this. It doesn't actually come up in very blunt terms. And having worked in high-risk operations most of my life, the first thing you have to do to solve a problem is be honest about what that problem actually is. So why is it an immediate existential risk? Well, firstly, what does existential mean? And it's basically a risk posing permanent large negative consequences to humanity, which can never be undone. An adverse outcome that's either going to annihilate intelligent life or permanently and drastically curtail its potential. Not easy words, but we need to actually recognise that that is what is being said. And an emergency response is essentially, if we're going to manage that, I think it's been enough evidence put forward this morning that that indeed is the case. The markets are important, but they're not going to solve it in isolation. Regulation is going to be needed, and it's going to have to be very different from the sort of regulation we tend to think about in conventional market systems and corporate national activities. What's the rationale for all of that? Well, firstly, we're already seeing dangerous climate change, as I said, at 1 degree C. To stay below 2, we're going to have to peak emissions by 2020, then reduce them extremely rapidly, and 1.5 even more rapidly. And at the moment, they're going up in line with worst-case scenarios. The carbon budgets we touched on, I think John mentioned 66% chance or whatever, is not particularly good odds for what really amounts to the future of humanity. If you up the ante to 90%, which in engineering terms is still not very good, you wouldn't get on a plane to London with a 10% chance of failure. But at 90%, there's no carbon budget left today to meet 2 degrees C, let alone 1.5. Climate inertia means that the continuing fossil fuel investments, if you listen to the chief executives of the major oil companies around the world, we're going to be here for decades to come, and fossil fuels, yes, will get phased out, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. Those investments in the absence of a carbon budget, because of climate inertia, which we don't see the full results of for some decades, are going to lock in the type of existential outcome that we don't want. And we have the aerosols point John raised. We're going to see, as we clean up the atmosphere, another 0.3 to 0.5 degrees C temperature increase in a one-off sense, which is going to make the compounding of the problem of staying below those warming limits. And the Paris solutions finally rely on the negative emission technologies to remove carbon. They're non-existent at scale today, and yet we're placing enormous weight on the fact that they will get us out of trouble. And I would suggest that's extremely dangerous, and it just creates a totally false sense of security, that they're easy solutions when we actually don't have any. Now, that's the situation we're actually in, and you therefore really have to refocus. And what that says to me is it's impossible now to stay below 1.5, whatever we do, and probably below 2 unless we really get our act together in a way that nobody has thus far seriously talked about, with a desire to really see much more fundamental change than I think is in the current dialogue. Sensible risk management addresses risk before it actually happens. And that time, frankly, is now. If we don't start to use those techniques, then really you can forget solving climate change. And risk management won't work in the way that conventional markets actually look at it. If you're talking about existential risk, it's not a question of the type of risk management that financial markets use and so on. You really have to say, look, we're here today, we have to get there tomorrow, how do you do it? And that's a completely different approach from the one that is in the current discussions. So you're told very frequently, look, you can't say these sort of things, it scares the horses, you shouldn't do it psychologically, it's all wrong. In my experience, that absolutely is completely the worst thing you can do. You've got to be honest about the problem. You have to normalize the fact in our thinking that that is what we're facing. You have to socialize it so it gets discussed as a normal course of events, and we then have to use that as the basis for planning and action. And unless we do that, then I think we're going to continue to go around and run in circles. So really what we want out of this is global collective action rather than conflict to become the norm. At the moment, I think we're headed in the latter direction, and we really have to change that dialogue. The priorities, I won't go into these in detail because Anders has basically touched on them. But I think what we're trying to do with this initiative is to make the point that the two real points of difference are, one, the existential risk, two, the fact you have to take an emergency response. And the question then is, well, how are you actually going to make this happen? Because we have all these lists, we've all looked at them, we've all tried to do it. What we hope the Club of Rome can do is really act as a catalyst to bring a lot of these disparate groups together. There's tremendous good work being done, but it's not against the fact that those are the real issues we've got. So what we would hope is to act as a mechanism to initiate that discussion and start a different sort of approach to trying to solve the entire problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ian.
And I'll just leave a few references if anybody wants to contest me on those points.
Thank you. You've mentioned, and we have all been thinking about this climate action plan as to some degree a war plan. The language has to be very careful. So we decided not to call it a war plan, but instead call it an emergency plan. I'd like to ask Camilla now to speak a little bit about some of the incredible work that she's been doing, because security, war, existential threat is something that she's become increasingly familiar with as she's been working for the last year, if not longer, on the issue of climate security. And of course, climate migration as well is part of that very important climate security issue. So, Camilla.
Thanks, Sandrine, for queuing me up, for having the discussion about all the fun and optimistic parts of the discussion on climate change. So first of all, just to say thank you for having me here. It's an honor to be here and to be in the room with so many people who are focused on moving us forward on this agenda. And I'm going to be building a lot now on what John, Ian, and Connie have all said. So thank you very much for those inputs so far. So first of all, I wanted to just recognize that when the Club of Rome was founded, that was 50 years ago, I was still a good way off from being born. So from where I'm sitting, people alive in 1968 are a generation away. And whilst my dad, born in 1952, and my mum, born in 1961, together we can all enjoy the Beatles' Yellow Submarine, which incidentally was launched also in 1968, in many ways we live worlds away. So we have made great progress in the last 50 years. We've made progress to tackle climate change, we've made progress to spread prosperity, and we've made progress to curb discrimination on the basis of gender, race, and sexuality. But the forecast for the next 50 years is not looking so good. We've heard that here today. There has been a breakdown between their generation and mine, the world where me and my siblings and my generation will live out our adulthood does not offer the prospects my parents once had. The next 50 years offer up a daunting challenge. Climate change may be the sharpened edge for societal and environmental chaos, but we also live in a world, again touched on today in many of the speeches, of entrenched individualism, weakening institutions, a clampdown on civil society, which makes our job harder, rising populism, and other environmental failures, creating what I can only describe as some kind of toxic soup where each challenge seasons and deepens the flavor of each parallel challenge. But I started with the negatives, but what I want to say is we cannot afford to let this intergenerational breakdown repeat itself. We are in too deep, and regardless of our age, that heartbreak isn't easy for any of us to bear. The future will be tough. Let's not kid ourselves. We need to have that radical honesty about the future to be able to tackle it. You might be forgiven for thinking, perhaps, if we don't try, things will be easier. But that is simply not the case. Upon the release of the IPCC report, and I think this really touches on Ian's point just there, all the commentators were discussing at length whether it was feasible, possible, or probable that we can deliver transformational mitigation. But the question they consistently failed to ask was, is it possible, feasible, or probable that we can cope with 1.5 degrees of warming, let alone 2 degrees, let alone 3 degrees, let alone more? It's like we've lost track of why we started doing this in the first place, and I think Ian made that point very eloquently. That said, this is not grounds for giving up. I found it hard today to hear from a few people asking questions in the audience or from panelists sort of saying, are we going to be able to do this? Are we not going to be able to do this? But for me personally, this is going to be my life. It's likely that I'm going to live for another 50 years. And I'm not about to give up. We must be radically honest. We have to tell the truth. But we also have to reverse the tide of pessimism and find new ways to aspire for a better future. Aspiring for the future moving forward does not look like the aspirations that my parents held and that generation before me. The Climate Emergency Plan, I think, is a really excellent start. It inks out the technology choices and policies we need to limit warming below 1.5 degrees. But I have to say, I did notice something here. Most of these technologies already existed in 1948. Some not, but many of them did. For example, the first solar cell was invented in the US in 1941, and the first evidence of wind power dates back to 5000 BC, where water-propelled boats graced the Nile. It's not technology that is lacking, it's politics. Economics is taking us some of the distance, creating opportunities from delivering low-carbon technologies and climate resilience, and we should celebrate that. It got us the Paris Agreement. It's got us this far, as is the sustained, if fragile commitment to multilateralism, the rules-based system, and to science. But to deliver transformational solutions, we need to change gears. The fact is, we need political forces from the grassroots to the grass tops to create the political cultures and strong institutions, however boring that may sound, that can deliver radical mitigation on the one hand and manage the fallout of radical climate change on the other. They will come together. We can't just deal with mitigation in a vacuum. We will be dealing with mitigation as the climate is changing. In recent years, we can see how dangerous unmanaged radical change can be it the UK referendum on EU membership, which was tough, or the election of Donald Trump, also tough. We know change is coming, and we need to make the ride as smooth and as fair as possible. It's not too late to create the political cultures and strong institutions we need. We have a lot to learn, and we will make mistakes, but it is possible. So, on to the work that I've been doing on climate security. Long preamble there. So since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, we knew, as in the run-up to the Paris Agreement, we weren't going to get near the 2-degree trajectory of warming. So I began focusing my attention on finding solutions for managing second and third order climate risks. So just to give a sort of basic explanation of what I mean by second and third. First is kind of direct impacts, so a flood, a drought. Second order is systems, so the food system, for example, water systems. And the third order is political, so that could be migration and conflict. So predominantly, we've been sort of catch-all I've been working on as the sort of climate-related security risks. And what I want to say to you is, I started working on this, people thought I was a bit crazy, I wasn't going to make any progress in the Security Council or any of the UN institutions. But you know what? We've made surprisingly good progress. So this is possible. And when I started out, I thought we'd be spending much of the time marshalling the scientific evidence, talking about the projections, the possibilities of climate-related risks, and thinking about how in the future could we be prepared to manage them. But sadly, this reality is being lived out right now. So I didn't have to think about it like that. So I'll just give one example from a recent study that I did. So in Iraq, attempts to stabilize the country have been unsettled drastically by a worsening water crisis. Iraq depends on its neighbors for 91% of its water access. And conflict has battered infrastructure and drained reserves of family and community resilience. Millions of people living on Iraq's riverbanks face displacement. And when the rains don't come and farmers can't work, a thirsty and barren Iraq offers fertile ground for recruitment from ISIS and post-ISIS groups. The threat of conflict is never far away, and Iraq is just one of these examples. This is being seen in pockets across the world. But now, thanks to some work that I've been doing with several brilliant individuals, including my colleagues at the Stockholm International Peace and Research Institute, or SIPRI, it isn't just me who's recognizing these realities. In the past 2 years, the Security Council has called for climate risk assessment and management strategies to inform security operations in 5 distinct geographies. Okay, it's a bit technical, but as we've said several times during today, we need to know what we're measuring to be able to act on it. And in July, a Swedish-chaired debate saw the majority of Security Council members and affected groups calling for a strengthening of the UN's capacity to address climate-related security risks. The challenge for the UN and all institutions around the world is that they were not created, not all, but most institutions around the world, is that they were not created in a climate-changed world. They've never had to learn how to become fit for purpose in this world. They've never had this reality to think about and to think about how it affects their day jobs. But today, these institutions cannot rest on their laurels. If they do so, they will fail to deliver on their core missions, and we really need to understand that. Decision makers need to have that climate risk information so that they can make climate risk-informed decisions. So if I think, for example, here in Rome, the World Food Programme, as the scale and intensity of climate extremes rockets, old ways of working simply just won't suffice, people will go hungry, and people will ask, what's the point? Why invest in the UN? Why invest in a broken multilateral system? But we know that we need that multilateral system. It may be imperfect, but it is a crucial piece of the puzzle for addressing 21st century challenges in a globalized world. And this is why it's investing in. Today, the UN and other institutions need to create the capacity that can help facilitate these changes, which make them fit for purpose in a climate change world. This includes putting in place the monitoring and contingency planning for addressing new climate extremes like mass migration, it's coming, and climate tipping point reach, which was mentioned several times today. Make no mistake, it is completely irresponsible that today we have no governance of climate tipping points. There is no system to monitor them, and there is no system to understand what the global response will be. Moving forward, we will make mistakes. We will have to learn the hard way at times, but institutional innovation and reform are part and parcel to making institutes relevant and creating public permissions for change. If we do not do that, we will not have the permission to move forwards. We've done it before, though. It's okay. We've done it with gender, we've done it with terrorism, or even we've done it with, for example, introducing the internet. That wasn't part of institutions before. But now we must get real and get honest about impending climate realities. We need institutions to understand their risk, identify whose job it is to take responsibility. We didn't have it before, so it's no one's job a lot of the time. And then we need to respond by building that institutional resilience. So looking forward, the Secretary-General's Climate Summit in September 2019 will be an important moment on this journey, a moment where the world will need to show that they are tackling the whole of the climate challenge. We spend a lot of time focusing on mitigation. Quite understandably, when we started, we thought that we could do mitigation and that would take us far enough. But now we can't just tackle mitigation. We also have to show that we're cooperating to respond to the fallout of climate change on security, on peace, and on prosperity. So, to conclude, what does the future hold? Do we still have a chance to preserve civilization on Earth, as the question was posed earlier? So it's a tricky question. So what would I say to that? I'd say, I am realistic about physics, I am pessimistic about inertia, but I am and continue to be optimistic about the strength of the human spirit. We must act on climate change with the full and heartfelt knowledge that the costs of inaction to us, to our families, to our communities, to our way of living are far higher than the costs of action. We must make our institutions and political cultures fit for purpose to deliver transformation in the full knowledge that if we don't, we will all lose faith in them. And we must invest in the actions that bring us together and draw from the best of the human spirit. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you, Camilla. It's clear that the action plan comes at a time when it's necessary. We've also talked about the existential risk and also the need for governance. So hopefully this plan will respond to some of the issues that you've brought forward. And maybe part of that plan is something that Connie, myself, and Anders speak about a lot because we sit on the advisory board of Climate Kick, which is, and it's something that you brought up, Connie, as well, and Anders has brought up before, and Ian has brought up, and many of you, and that is that sometimes you might have to bake 2 cakes. And that's the fact that we all know that we have to totally redevelop our systems, but in the meantime, as we're in it and we're in the change, we're going to have to figure out how to react immediately to that while we're totally shifting our existing economic system, political system, and other very important systemic exchanges and links. So that is something that we have to think about, is we've got the short-term response that's immediate and then the longer-term perspective. So part of that is very much looked at in the way in which we look at urbanization. Yoshi, I've given you well, I haven't given you, the organizers have given you the very difficult task of concluding at the end of a conference when we are all overheating, when a lot of people have had to leave because I think they've already overheated or they fell asleep, not because the content was not important, but because it's hard when it's this hot. And I keep on saying get used to it, but it is hard. So if you could try to keep it short, I know that's not fair. And we will still try to have some kind of interaction with all of you because this is really important, but we'll have to do it short because not only that, but we're going to get kicked out of the building in the next 40 minutes from what I understand because they lock everything up.
The next 25 minutes.
Yeah, 25 minutes I've been told.
Okay, thank you. Please, slide. Now I would like to invite you to a totally different world. And I will guide you to Bangkok for your tourism, sightseeing, okay? Slide I need. Okay, before, I think Club of Rome should look at the reality based on data much more. And then we have to analyze what is wrong and what we can do for whom and for where, for which country or for which site of the city. That I would like to stress space. Database discussions, CAM1 is an excellent collections of views full of real data. And I talked now a little bit different story. What is this you understand? 4:30 a.m., 1993. This is 20 kilometers away from city center, Bangkok. What he's doing, maybe a high school student, his school is in the city center, starting at 8:30. He should be there already at 4:30. That was, at that time, Bangkok. Why like this? Because of this. Full of cars. According to our statistics, our means, I was the chairman of JICA study to totally reform Bangkok. There were no urban railways at the time. Okay, so no pointer, but just in the center there's a van. That is JICA van. Okay, we were staying the white building over there, in between crossing. It is only 300 meters. It took 1.5 hours. Okay. And because I would like to show in my class to the students, there's a pedestrian bridge, and I took this photo, and I did not want to be left rushed. And I thought this was our car, our van, but our van was still there. That was Bangkok at the time. Because they totally neglected railways. So much before Trump, they declared car first. Okay? Not America first, car first. Okay? Why so? Economic growth, that's a good thing, and everyone has a dream to be better life at the end. But the reality, almost not. Why? One way, economic growth means income increase. That makes people afford cars. Okay? The more and more cars. And the bottom is, economic growth is not happening equally in the country. Capital city and some limited cities, but rural areas very poor. So people are migrating into cities, and more, and then spread over urban sprawl. And then travel time will become longer and longer, and more cars. At the end, so huge, unnecessary demand, that's called excess demand. That will create huge loss of energy and emissions, etc. This is just data, per capita income, and then car ownership. Tokyo green stabilized earliest. London going up. This graph was originally prepared by my ex-Thai student, 1992. The other time, 2 plots only. So we discussed Bangkok should follow Tokyo, not to own cars some more. But in fact, today, plotted, then exceeded London. Okay? And this is another one. So the title is Limit to Growth. But by this figure, we cannot define the limit to growth in motorization. This can be done. The right-hand side is a very simple indicator of congestion. Okay? The car ownership is now horizontal, the previous vertical one. Okay? More and more cars, but the road length per registered car declining. If you can construct the road at the same time, at the same speed as car ownership increase, the curve must be level. But it's impossible. Even Lamborghini Countach is much cheaper than to construct the road for Lamborghini Countach to drive. Okay? That's very much simple. And then finally, this curve, a simple one, speed. Per kilometer, how many minutes you need? It's interesting, about 5 meters per car or 6 meters per car, London and Bangkok both suddenly going into the traffic jam. That I define the limit to growth. Maybe I should stop very soon. I will skip this. More and more cars, not the developed countries, now developing countries more. This is another story, suburbanization. Okay? London was successful in keeping green belt. Okay? Tokyo failed to keep green belt, suburbanized, but suburbanized along with railways. At the end, per person, transport energy consumption is about the same. This is extension of urban sprawl. Okay? There are a lot of measures strategies and instruments for low carbon. We have done a lot of research. But today, a lot of talks were low carbon. Then I skip it. And this is today's Bangkok. This is much nicer, but still, some parts still there. Okay? Changing traffic signal doesn't make sense. So autonomous driving may help or not, may not so easily. And then there are merits and demerits of autonomous driving, etc. Then finally, we are proposing to maximize, don't choose, when going out in the morning, I will use car, I will use railways. No, that's nonsense. But rather, we are now developing a system. Requested data input is, I should be in office from 10 to 2. I should pick up my kid at the kindergarten at 4. Okay? And then shopping at 5, somewhere else. That is only input. Then our system or AI will maximize today's your quality of life. Don't go out now because we caught very easily traffic jam. So we recommend 1 hour later would be much better. So in such a way, quality of life maybe calculated. I skip everything, everything, and then finally, as Ernst proposed, factor 4, efficiency. Efficiency is income divided by CO2 or GDP divided by CO2. But now we are proposing quality of life divided by CO2. So that is sufficiency indicator. So this is the case of calculation of Singapore, where and for whom young lady, old man, etc., different.
Yoshi, I'm going to have to ask you to stop.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now I finish up. So only 7 minutes is not enough to guide you in Bangkok. Please ask me. I'm very much prepared to guide you. Thank you.
So Yoshi, the part that you didn't get to say was the link to climate, but we all know that mobility is absolutely essential, and also urbanization and urban systems need to fundamentally change. And part of the growth issue, obviously, is that Bangkok is only one of the many cities in Asia and other parts of developing countries where they're replicating our old systems and building totally intense, congested cities rather than trying to figure out from the beginning to leapfrog and not create the same problems. So I would like to open up now to any questions. I had one from Vala here. I've got one here. Oof, good. You're all enthused about wanting to still ask questions. Wonderful. So Vala, why don't we start here, and then why don't we go down this line, and then we'll come over here, and we will get you as well. And then we'll have to go. We've got, so be very quick, because we have 20 minutes. I've been told we really have to leave.
We have 15 minutes, I think.
15.
Anyway, my question is, we've talked about tipping points in the natural system, and we know we are approaching many of them. What about tipping points in human behavior? You know, all of you are experienced in talking about climate change, even as an emergency. Where have you actually seen change happening because of some new idea coming out or some actions being done?
Okay, I'm going to go down the line. Okay, we're just going to go 1, 2, 3. You guys are going to shoot them out, and we're going to try to answer very quickly. This is going to be the most incredible speed questioning dating exercise we've ever done. So,
very simple one. When are we going to phase out combustion engine and how?
Sorry, we didn't hear.
When are we likely to phase out combustion engines for transportation, and how exactly is it going to be achieved?
Great, phase out the combustion engine. Next.
in order to allow the climate emergency action plan bring to collective action. Why don't Club of Rome make an organizational change allowing junior members under 40 years, let's say 500, 1,000 every year, in order to increase the number of the membership? And another, why don't you release all the new reports, not in form of books, but in form of video games, TV series, anime, and manga?
Excellent. Thank you. Next.
Yeah, my name is Marcus Fischer. I'm studying at Sciences Po Paris, and my question is actually very much linking to yours. We've seen that communicating climate change is very important, and we've all seen the fascinating lecture of Professor Schellnhuber. But when you remember, there was this graph with the black curves and the blue curves, and when the two intersect, then there's a link to the Ice Age. And I think this might not be the right point of how we can communicate. But maybe we rather want to use video games, or we want to use movies, or we want to use even art. And I think this worked to some extent because there is a lot of entertainment and a lot of art for social rights and anti-discrimination. Yeah. So maybe could this be an option to use entertainment and art to communicate climate change issues?
Next.
Vitor Comer from Brazil. I've been working the last 30 years with the indigenous communities, and the question I'm putting is that we have a definite cultural tipping point right in front of our nose. These communities have incredible knowledge, and they should be aided not only to survive, but to give us an understanding of the deep relationship that they are able to develop with all living beings. And this is very important because there's hard evidence, scientific, that they are building resilience more than 30 years in relationship to their crops and other production, so that where, as scientists, we know 5, 6 species.
Okay, I'm going to have to cut you off because we don't have enough time.
But develop, we're enchanted with technology and technological advancement. But we have to be enchanted with the human being and understand inclusively its transcendent nature, its capacity, and its potential that these communities still have. And this is an inquiry, a scientific inquiry into the mind of the human being and the importance of culture, cultural survival. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so I made a promise I'd try to get to all of you. I think it's going to be close to impossible because I keep on being told we're going to close the doors.
Very quick question. People decide easily, so what do the panelists think about following solution to provide electricity for zero costs, to provide fuel, coal, etc. for high costs? Would it be possible for governments or politics to manage such a solution because people decide on easy facts and price is an easy fact?
Okay, thank you. Okay, if you guys can blurt it out
Similar
in 2 minutes, but we have to be able to answer you. So the problem is the more of you, it's...
We have 10 minutes left. Yeah. Similar to all points, education, more emphasis, if you could please discuss about education to the young ones, because they are the life of the future, and
education.
Indigenous people, and also military, finding out from the military more hidden agendas so that they can come and back up this. Okay. Otherwise, this is useless.
Yes,
in my
so
opinion.
we actually do a lot of work with military and faith groups
I've heard,
and other
and
groups.
I'm very, very happy that it started. It's fantastic.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take, we haven't taken any questions from over here. So we've got one here, but they really have to be very quick, and that's it, one. Because he's been asking, actually, you've been asking for a while, but it has to be quick. What? Can we bring a microphone, please?
Ms. Hedegaard brought up the point that the concern that China is funding coal plants in Kosovo and in Bosnia and so on. So my question basically is this. It seems that all our plans for cleaning up are going to be a major burden to the emerging economies, which now also dirty most, okay, and are exponentially growing. We cannot, as a Club of Rome, dump all the problem on them. If they build coal plants, not because they like coal, obviously, because it's the cheapest that they can afford.
Yes.
So we really have to look into that.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm gonna stop them. I'm really sorry, but I'm gonna honor one of the people that I've seen for the entire afternoon, which is the gentleman right there in the blue shirt that has the blazer on, because you did not get your chance on the economics. And that's it. I'm closing it. But you are young, so reframe and give me 2 words, 3 words of what you wanted to say, and you can belt it out because you don't need a microphone. Absolutely, and we can talk about it afterwards. So, can I go down the road, and I'd like to start with Connie.
Very, very briefly, then, on this one, the good thing is that renewables have come down substantially in price, and that is what will hopefully bring us in the right direction. If you look to India, for instance, solar and renewables in general, they are coming down the price. But you are right that there are good reasons why countries are doing as they do, but at least we could stop subsidizing the wrong thing and supporting more the right thing. But I think that we are coming down there. We have plenty of evidence for the price actually being competitive now. The other thing on electricity for zero cost and coal for a higher cost, it sounds nice, but in this short answer, won't happen. Sorry for that, but I think, again, to price externalities and to stop subsidizing the wrong is at least sort of the best step forward I can see. Then there was a question on combustion engines. When will we phase that out? I must say, I personally believe that it comes faster than most people think, and I think it would not be that unthinkable today. 5 years ago, it had been unthinkable that, for instance, at the European level, you would have a prohibition for combustion engines, say, 2030. It's not easy to get there, but I think that we see things are really, really speeding up and moving in that direction. And final thing on the human behavior, where do we see that? Just give you one example. I see it in many areas, but I think, for instance, in meat consumption. I see in mature economy, not of course in developing countries where people want still to have the protein and things like that from meat, but in many of the developed countries we can see that meat consumption is changing. The consumption patterns, not the least among young people, but in general, in my own country, Denmark, for the 5th year in a row, meat consumption is declining, and we see it in another of other countries and in California as well. I really think that that is behavioral change that 10 years ago would have been unthinkable.
May I just add a few comments? One on combustion engines. I agree very much that we have to phase them out as soon as possible, as long as they are run by fossil fuels. There are smart biofuels. But we have to keep in mind that there are almost 1 billion combustion engines on the roads. So those fall in the category of stranded assets if we do it too quickly. And we have the same problem in many industrial sectors. I remind people of the fact that we have 1.6 billion tons of coal being produced every year. We have started a project, very promising in Sweden, to leave behind the traditional furnaces and go for hydrogen, and then no CO2 in the production. But Sweden is 5 million tons. It will take a long time to phase out the other ones. So this issue about stranded assets and how to finance that in different sectors, including transport, is a major issue that the political system has to come up with a solution to, in cooperation with the financial sector. Absolutely.
Can someone talk about Ian, but not on the combustion engine, on some of the other questions.
Just respond to the question about human evidence of human behavioural change. I think we are actually starting to see it. I mean, if you look at farmers in Australia now, they're suddenly waking up to the fact that the droughts that we're seeing are actually climate-related. If you look at the investment community around the world, the long-term pension funds, superannuation funds are increasingly recognizing that the risks they're now exposed to are in fact directly climate-related. The regulators are getting onto the same bandwagon. It's all not happening fast enough. But the fact is that these things are actually now starting to occur. And to get them to really move at the pace we want, we actually need some lever which is going to suddenly wake people up, because otherwise it isn't going to happen. And I suspect that will probably be further extreme events of some kind or other.
So, if I may, I'm going to close. But I'm going to close answering the last questions around education in the indigenous peoples and the organizational change within the Club of Rome. And I'm going to try to do that very fast. Absolutely, we need to preserve the intelligence of the indigenous people, and we don't do that enough. Not only that, we're not even respecting the fact that half of their ancestors are going to be under the sea. I spoke about this in our own meeting this week. I have friends who are holding on to their Pacific Islands and their ancestry, but they know that either they're going to die with them in the next 5 years, not in the next 100 years, because all of the people are being displaced, or they're going to have to be displaced into communities that, by the way, don't want them. So absolutely, not only do we need to understand the intelligence of the indigenous peoples, which we have never understood, but we need to also realize that we're going to be losing some of these civilizations, and they're just going to start dropping off into the sea. Number 2, education, absolutely fundamental, and I'll be announcing hopefully something tomorrow also about the way in which we want to collaborate in the area of education. We need to ensure that we infiltrate the thinking that we've been talking about at all levels of education, starting at primary school level. And that comes to the organizational change within the Club of Rome. I am not under 40, sorry. I'm 52. I still consider myself to be young. We will be working with more junior members of the Club of Rome. We will be thinking around new ways to communicate, because many of the ways in which we've communicated have not worked, and we have to find new ways. And that means not necessarily creating a bunch of video games, which, by the way, I never let my kids play anyway, and luckily they were never interested. But let's try to figure out some smart ways to get different generations interested. And this has to be intergenerational, because we can't continue that gap either, where the millenniums go on onto a digital age, and then we leave behind all the others, like myself, who are still trying to catch up and understand what's going on. So we need to work collectively on these different types of solutions. There will be a change within the Club of Rome, like any club that needs to evolve after 50 years. And that is what I leave you with. Please join us tomorrow, because we will continue this conversation. And can I thank you for sticking it out under a very, very hot condition. It means you are resilient to a certain degree. Obviously, others were not as resilient as you were. So thank you.
Is this your...